Hello and welcome back to Dicebreaker for another one of our RPG discussions. I'm once again Wheels, this is once again Liv, and today we are talking about how to write a compelling villain for your RPG campaign. Just like that. And look how compelling that was. 2 villains. We're getting ahead of ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah, when it comes to an RPG campaign, especially like a classical one, especially if you're playing something like D&D or whatever, where you've got like the heroes and the bad guy, you need a bad guy, and that bad guy needs to be interesting.
Yeah.
Because if you've got someone that is literally just like, I am bad for the sake of being bad, 1, it's boring.
Super boring.
2, who is actually like that, you know, becomes a bit like less believable, a little bit like cartoonish. And 3, why should your players care? Is the other point. So these are sort of like points that we've put together to sort of talk about steps you can take to make them a little bit more interesting, a little bit more compelling, as we said. So we're going to start right away with the big thing that any character, regardless of where they are on the moral compass, needs, and that, Liv, is motivation.
Motivation. Love it. Mr. Motivator. That's my evil villain.
Mr. Motivator is taking over the world. What can you do?
He just keeps everyone exercising. That'd be terrible.
But not in a fun way.
No, they're not motivated.
Motivation is important.
Yes.
It's, you know, the big question is, why are they a villain? Right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't always have to be, you know, for the sake of being a villain. In fact, it probably should be.
Yeah, what you were saying that really caught my attention and is really interesting is that, you know, they, just like the PCs, need a motivation because they are characters at the end of the day. You should treat them as if they are your own PC that you're making if you're a DM, you know?
Yeah, and I think we're calling them a villain because it's easier to talk about, but really they're just the antagonist, right? Which in classical story structure, they are the person that is stopping the, you know, the main protagonist from doing what they need to do, or they are changing the world in a way in which is like messing around with either the protagonist themselves or what they care about.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess it's the kind of background we're going to start with, really, with like why are they a villain? Which is a very big question to answer, I suppose.
But like it's slightly more complicated, but it's kind of the same question of like, why are you an adventurer, right?
Yeah, sure.
So if once again, if we talk about D&D as like the sort of the one that most of you are going to be playing when you watch this video,
but it can be transferred to any RPG.
Yeah, literally anything. If you are a sort of, and again, this is the antagonist, so you could be bad people fighting against a good guy, right?
You could be, I was literally thinking that, just like, you know, if your characters are morally great, maybe the person that they're going ahead against appears to be a villain at first, but then you realize, oh wait, we're the bad guys.
Yeah.
Oh, you know, which
can be really fun as well, especially if the players aren't really aware of that at the start. But like we'll get to that in a second.
Yes.
But the main question is like, how has this character, this antagonist or villain or person who is stopping your players from doing what they want to do, how have they gotten to this situation?
Yeah.
So let's say that they are, think about like the classic evil characters, I'm going to take over the world. Why are they taking over the world? Like what?
Gaston?
Yes.
Oh,
he's going to burn all the books and eat all the eggs. So let's step back from that position that we're in and say, okay, what does this character want from that situation? Why did they specifically want to rule the world? Why do they want to defeat the good guys? Why do they want to take over the city? Why do they want to kill this important character? Like, what is driving them to do what they're doing? Yeah. And what drove them to this position that they're now in? So it's kind of like a background for your character, right? It's like,
exactly.
Why are you here?
Like, I try to, well, I mean, it's a very fine line as well from being like, oh, you know, this character's trauma made them a villain, because that doesn't always necessarily have to be the case. And it's like, you know, trauma doesn't make you inherently evil. But like, maybe there was just something even quite minor in their past that, you know, they latched onto, or like they had an authority figure that made them think, oh, I should be like that, but like to a bigger extreme. Maybe they lost someone. Maybe they're just bad. No, that's not good. That's not what we're saying. They're just bad.
Like,
No.
if you are telling that kind of cartoonish story, it's fine to have a cartoonish villain who was like, I am Doctor Evil from Planet Evil of the evil dimension,
Yes.
and I am here to commit evil. Like, that's fun and that's funny, and if that's the vibe you're going for, that's fine.
As an example of that, I would say Magic Brian from the Adventure Zone is just like that. So basically, the characters come in and he's just like, "Oh, hello, darling. I am here and I am evil." You know, like that's what he sounds like. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
But also, you've got to sort of think about the villain in the context of the story that you're telling. So, if you are telling like a super serious, grounded, gritty, grimdark story, and then it's just like, I'm Mr. Evil, then it's, even if you don't call them that, it's a bit transparent that it's just like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you a villain?
Yeah, like maybe the players get the impression that you thought about the villain last around the rest of the story, and then that can give you away if that's the case.
But also, like, you know, we're not talking about their goal necessarily yet. We're talking about, like, either an inciting incident or, you know, some kind of, like, philosophy that they have that goes against the world. Like, I like to think about, I think one of the easiest to understand and best villains that have been written in sort of pop culture recently, I think, is Syndrome from The Incredibles.
Syndrome is fantastic.
Yeah, it's a very, very, he's not necessarily the most compelling villain ever written, but he's such a clear example of how you write villains, where it's, this is someone who had their worldview changed by an event. In this case, sorry for spoilers for this film from 2007 or something, I don't know. But yeah, so like the inciting incident was, our villain used to worship the protagonists, like thought that they walked on water, thought that they were the most amazing person on earth, and then when they were essentially cast aside by them, it harbored resentment inside of him, and suddenly that drove him to see the world in a different way. And you don't have to talk about, you know, his end goal is for everyone to be super so that no one is, or whatever, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is fun, and it's cool, and I love it. But also, you know, that's the next step. It's like, you know, you start with, why do they see the world in the way that they do? Why do they think about things in the way that they do? And then what does that lead on to? Rather than sort of going backwards and saying, okay, well, this guy's trying to take over to the city. Why is he doing that? And then having to think about that. Like, think about what that character believes in, wants, you know, what they desire from the world, and then think about how they're going to achieve that.
Yeah, and particularly with Syndrome, it's a very human flaw, which is just that, you know, he was told no.
But it's also like, it's the need for acceptance, it's like jealousy, it's like, there's a lot of like very normal human characteristics that you can assign to that sort of worldview and goal. Whereas, you know, let's say that we've got your fictional villain that you're writing right now, and, you know, he's like, let's say he's like a sort of Machiavellian figure who's trying to like take over, name fictional city, Waterdeep, that's a fictional city, there you go. Let's say that he's trying to take over the city and he wants to be the head honcho and he's willing to do anything to make it happen. That's cool, that's interesting.
Great.
Why is he here? Like, how has he gotten to that point? Because people don't like just become ruthless.
No,
you know?
exactly. Like with that example there that you just made up, maybe they're trying to take over because they had little control in their youth, and so they're trying to take back control. Like, it could be stuff like that that even you can identify with, which can be a really good motivator and, you know, really good past.
And then there's, you know, there's also like, there doesn't necessarily have to be an inciting incident. But it gives like a very clear thing that you can set in the storyline, in the timeline of your events, where you can be like, well, you know, this is where it all kicked off, and then that's like a thing that your characters can reference. And like, if you're going for like a non-violent solution or whatever, they can talk to be like, you know, the world's changed now. You don't have to think like this,
you don't have to be like this. And it's something that we'll get onto later, you know, but maybe your characters were involved in that inciting incident. How would that play out? But that's something we'll get onto a little bit later.
Yeah, so like we've got like a sort of sub point here called like, why are they doing what they're doing? So like, this isn't necessarily like why they are the person that they are today, but before you get to the goal, I think it's good to give them a platform of what what's driving like their emotions as they make these decisions. So
Yeah.
like some of the examples are like revenge was like there's something terrible that happened to them, or like something like embarrassing. Did someone like belittle them or something like that?
Yeah.
Or did someone did like a regime end up murdering someone that they love?
Yeah,
or
and they're
like,
avenging them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or destroying their livelihood or something like that. Is there like a personal like spite that comes through?
Yeah, and also it can also be like if there was like an authority that's wholly good, well, in general, and there was one person who made them feel this way, like, and they're basically only going for that one person, but they've made it about everyone else. Like that can be an interesting way to tackle it as well.
Yeah, like are they, say there's some kind of fictional government in your world, and like the city itself is imperfect but works, but because of the maybe the background that they have, and again, once again we'll talk about this in a second,
Yes.
but like your character, it doesn't necessarily your like antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be wrong in their argument, right?
Yeah.
Like if they are completely justified in the hatred that they have towards that system. First of all, it's more believable, but second of all, like it's going to give your characters like a moment to reflect about what position they hold.
Yeah, maybe they'll even change sides. You
yeah,
don't know.
who knows? But sometimes it's the methods that they use that they don't agree with, something like that. But yeah, so we've got other options here, like gain, like perhaps like they came from nothing and they wanted everything, or maybe it's pride, maybe it's something like they have realized almost themselves that they've gone too far, and at this point it's like I can't stop because this is who I am now.
Yeah, and I just have to keep going. When you said pride, immediately my head was like, yeah, they're gay, yeah.
But most villains in
Are
popular media
coded.
are gay coded.
Yeah,
so,
definitely.
Say what you will about that one, Walt Disney. But maybe it's like just straight up greed. Like maybe they just have like a privileged background. They don't always have to have something that like is admirable that they are trying to right in the world. Sometimes they're just like, they grew up in extreme privilege, and maybe they had like their name like torn down or whatever, or like maybe they just aren't as important as they used to be, and they hate that, and they want the world to like bend over backwards for them.
Totally. I think a good example of a villain like that might be Prince Charming from Shrek.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is a silly one, but also
Again,
like
Shrek 2, fantastic film.
Shrek 2 is fantastic.
Fantastic
yeah.
film. Like, if you want to use that as an example, that's absolutely fine.
Oh yeah, a perfect film.
Yeah.
But yeah, Prince Charming grew up as Prince Charming, basically, and had a mother that provided everything for him and expected everything to be handed to him on a plate. And when that didn't happen, that's when things started to fall apart for him. So yeah, that's a good one. But something that you might notice from the points that we have listed is that they can kind of all be tied to like the 7 deadly sins, which is something that I contributed, thinking like if you need to have like a motivator for a villain and you're not sure where to start, go to the 7 deadly sins and just think, okay, what is the one thing that they're always focused on? Are they always greedy? Are they, I don't know how sloth would work, but it could be very interesting to try and do that.
Yeah. Well, I think about like, if you've got some kind of like non-human figure, like some kind of like demonic figure or something, like maybe they are trying to like stop the world or something like that, to like bring it down to their level of speed or something.
Like Wall-E? Right? That's not exactly it. But there was... No, the robot is not trying to make everyone to bring down the world. Wall-E the robot is fine, but like that's the main issue with the story.
It's more like the concept of laziness
Yeah.
that is the villain, I guess. But anyway.
Yeah.
I think whilst the 7 deadly sins aren't necessarily like a perfect framework for real life, they are like a thing that was invented by humans. I'm an atheist, so sorry if anyone doesn't agree with that statement.
I'm agnostic.
But these are things that were sort of invented by humans to categorize the ways in which humans do wrong. So whilst they're not, 100% bulletproof, they are a really good jumping off point for people to just be like, okay, that kind of like fits into this kind of area. Like, oh, that's an interesting thing I've never really explored before. Like, how would a slothful villain work? How would a gluttonous villain work? Like all that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. It's a good point to mention not to make your villains like too one-dimensional in that respect, though.
Yes,
Especially if it's something that maybe society at large has had pretty unfair depictions of in the past. So like The gluttony, for example, would be something to be
Oh,
dangerous if
yeah.
you were to, just take something like that at face value. Doesn't mean that you can't explore it at all, but bear that in mind. When you're running your villains.
Maybe just try and think of it in like a more outside the box kind of thing. Like maybe they're just like the eater of worlds, like
Galactus, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, or
he's just hungry, right?
Yeah, or like another Adventure Zone reference. Spoilers for the Adventure Zone. There's like a big, like the darkness. It's not like the band The Darkness, but it's like a big wave of like shadow that comes along and eats worlds. Like that is gluttony in a way.
Just like, or even we call it gluttony, which implies that it's like wrong to want to eat, but it's not, right?
Yeah.
It's like a basic human need. It's a basic creature need. So like if your creature is not some kind of like all-powerful, all-knowing entity, and like they're doing things because of this large philosophical viewpoint. We'll touch on cosmic horror in a bit. The eater of worlds is not eating worlds because he like hates them and wants them to starve. Like you're just so insignificant to them that they're just like consuming matter. That's how they live, right?
Like, are we ants to them, and how do you deal with that?
Well, so let's talk about goals.
Yes.
So now that we've got the platform of like why your villain is a villain,
yes,
let's talk about what is driving them specifically in the story that you're telling. So perhaps they've done things before, perhaps they'll do other things to come, but what is the thing that they are trying to achieve in your story right now?
Yeah.
So, as we said, like any character you portray, your villain should have a goal that they're striving towards. So, if you are playing like a heroic paladin who is trying to spread the word of their good god or whatever, like there needs to be a similar thing that your villain is also trying to achieve, or your antagonist, as we should really call them.
Yeah.
The thing that they are striving for, the thing that they are trying to accomplish, which then you have to think about how does that impact what the players are trying to do as well.
Like a very specific and very opposite ends of the spectrum example I have is a PC that I've mentioned on the channel before, my Tiefling Paladin Logan Nickelwillow, which is a very D&D name, who was a servant of the sun god Lathander, and I was playing her in Icewind Dale, the Rime of the Frost Maiden. So she, the goddess of winter, wanted to make an eternal winter, and as a paladin of the sun god, I was like, that's not going to work for me. So it's just like, is it as simple a motivator as that? Simple in a way, but then that can kind of like branch off into like other storytelling mechanics, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's also a good example for like, you could flip that on its head. Neverwinter, for example, being a place that is just a frosty plain. If you've got a hero like that who is just like, no, I refuse for there to be cold in the world. Like, I'm like, maybe it is like a lesser god of warmth and like, sun and all that kind of stuff who is obsessed with trying to make the world in their vision. Not necessarily doing it from an evil perspective. It's just like they can't understand how a world like this can exist, and therefore they are willing to do anything to change it, right?
Yeah.
So that is a good example of how the characters' like aspirations of, I mean, in this case, the characters would just not want to die.
Yeah.
If the world is about to be bleached by the sun.
Yep.
But also you've got the goal of the villain, which is, in this case, I want to change the world in my image.
Yeah.
And then you can naturally see how those paths cross. Because if your goal is completely abstract from the rest of the story that you're telling and your players don't really have anything to do with it, then why are they the antagonist, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's a good example of like a way in which a villain would like to, destroy the world in effect, but it doesn't have to always be like that either. Maybe they're doing something that's like quite minor or would only affect them. For example, I think originally a character in a podcast I listened to wanted to ascend to become a god, but then it was just kind of like, what would they do with that power once they've got it? So it's like preventing them from going on to like the next step, and that's something that your characters can work towards as well.
Yeah, like sometimes it's not necessarily clear what the outcome's going to be. It's like you're worried about the possibility, right?
Yeah.
Because think of like a sort of think of like the classic like cyberpunk like, I am an all-powerful CEO of a mega corporation. I'm trying to like upload myself into the AI consciousness or whatever. That's not necessarily an evil action. It's the do we want someone like this
Yeah.
to have that much power over the world? And then that becomes the question that your party need to wrestle with, not just this person is doing something wrong and therefore we need to stop them, but like, do we trust this person to be in that position? Like, should we intervene, right?
Yeah, and is it your character's place to intervene? Like, I mean, if your GM puts something in front of you and it's like, oh, hey, like, maybe the GM is expecting us to stop this, maybe that's not always the case. Like, maybe they want to see what you're going to do with it, and that's a choice that you have to make for your character and for your party as well.
Yeah, I think it's always good to remember that the antagonist's worldview doesn't necessarily have to be a strict sort of like mirror to what the players represent, right? And I think a lot of the time, especially when you've got big party games, you'll have characters from all different kinds of viewpoints and stuff like that. I think a really good example of like an antagonist or even like multiple antagonists, for those of you who've played Fallout New Vegas, so that is a game in which there is no real clear like, here is, I mean, coming from like a moral standing, it's the fascist. But like, you know, there is no clear like, this is the person who is trying to destroy the world and here's what you need to do to stop it. Instead, it's like multiple factions all want to converge on this one same goal. You need to decide as the players which of those you agree with or, you know, are willing to stake your claim behind, because otherwise, you know, the thing that you don't want to happen might end up happening, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting you mentioned as well, like, multiple villains, because, like, there can be, like, you know, the big bad in, like, a campaign, but maybe there are, like, smaller villains that you have to deal with first. Like, for example, in Critical Role, you have the Briarwoods, who are currently being featured in, like, the Critical Role animated series. And it's really interesting to see them unfold, but, like, on the scale of things, like, what they're doing is kind of low-key.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the party would have actually done anything about it if it wasn't for the fact that Percy, a member of their party, had, like, a past with them. So it's, like, interesting to see, like, morally, like, would they even be doing this if it didn't, like, affect them personally?
Yeah. I think sometimes as well, a really interesting thing to discover with character villains is that, like, they don't necessarily need to... This is a difficult thing to like envision. I've got an example which I hope will clear it up. But like, characters don't necessarily need to have like a goal that is what they personally are striving for. It might be like a temporary means to an end, something like that. I like to think of, you know, in Red Dead 2, I think great story, great game. Like, there's no like, this person is the villain, because to avoid spoilers, like, a person, although it's not really spoilers if you've played the first game, but anyway, yeah. One of the characters that, you know, you see as a friend slowly morphs into the villain before you, right? And that's where it becomes the real conflict. But up until that point, you can't just have no antagonist. So there's a character called Leviticus Cornwall, who is essentially like this big business magnate, and he kind of represents everything that like the characters that you are playing see as wrong with the world, like the industrialization of the world, like big business, like ruining small people's lives, the fact like they are taking away small freedoms and stuff like that, goes against what that sort of party of characters represent and what they like, you know, base their livelihood off, even though their livelihood is like an amoral one because they are criminals, right? But the interesting thing with Cornwall is like, he's not a villain who is like trying to do something.
Yeah.
Like, his only motivation is to like get revenge on you for stealing all of his crap, right?
Which is fair enough.
Which is fair, yeah. Like, he's like not a good person, but he's not necessarily like in the wrong in this situation. The interesting thing about them though is like, it provides a platform for the characters in that story to question their position in the world, to question like what they believe in and how far they're willing to go to, you know, prove that, or to be a part of that, or to even like get revenge on something that happened to them. And it's that eye for an eye situation as well. Like, that is like a compelling sort of antagonist that isn't even necessarily striving for anything. He's just existing,
he's
and
just
like, you
living
are a
his
thorn
life
in his side, right?
Yeah, totally. I guess that the first part you mentioned, and I suppose kind of what I mentioned with Percy as well, and their past and their relation to the villain, that's something that can play like a really big role as well. So like, why would your party be attached to the idea of taking down this villain, especially if they're kind of small time in relation to everything else? They're not like the big bad. So like, what kind of past, what kind of, like, was it a traumatic incident? Like, what was the inciting incident if it relates to your party? Which I think is also kind of a really good hook for an adventure as well. Like, if you, something that I personally love to do as a GM is like take something from a character's backstory and then just be like, oh, here it is.
Oh, thanks for that.
Oh,
I'm just gonna follow that away for a second.
Yep. It's just like, oh, I'll take that to use against you in the future. But that's the kind of thing that would really like knock your players for a loop. For example, in the whole Briarwoods scenario, Matt Mercer literally, so the party are at a dinner, a very fancy dinner, and then Matt Mercer, the DM, just literally just says like, oh, can you give this to the Briarwoods, blah, blah, blah. And you can see immediately that Taliesin, who plays Percy, is just like, and just completely is knocked for a loop with just like a few words, and I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, there's also something to be said about the fact that like, you know, we often, I think even in like our Dungeon Breaker series around YouTube, like you can often see characters who aren't necessarily like the good archetype, like they are not necessarily always striving for the betterment of the world. And it is now, like, especially with the way in which we now view media, I think it's impossible to set a party in like games like D&D and Aegon and all that kind of stuff where like you are just like a group of characters who are the protagonists. It's almost impossible for them to all just want to do good things.
Yeah.
Like, even just the existence of things like the rogue, who is essentially looking out for themselves, like neutral characters, like chaotic characters, all that kind of stuff, where it's like you have people who aren't necessarily trying to make the world a better place. So if your entire story revolves around the fact that like, oh no, this village is being burnt down. You've never been here, you don't know anyone here. This village is being burnt down by a big villain, and it's just like, why do they specifically care? And this is where the relationship to the party and the villain has with the party is really important, because regardless of like what they think about the villain, like what they think about the situation and how much they care about what's happening, there is something that is inevitably pulling you towards that. So like if you look at any video game RPG that has the ability to make moral decisions. So if you think about like Baldur's Gate, for example, like 2 and 3 actually. If you think about things like New Vegas as well, like there are things that are specific to your character that, regardless of the evil that is happening in the world and what you want to do about it, push you through the story. Because in Baldur's Gate 3, you've got your tadpoles, right? It's like, we need to do something about this. Even if we don't want to stop them, we need to do something about this, otherwise we're going to die. In Baldur's Gate 2, like, your friend is kidnapped right at the start, so it's like, how are you going to resolve that? Also, the person that is the main antagonist, they're not just the big evil, they're also the big evil that's been, like, experimenting on you and is like haunting your dreams and stuff like that. Like, they have an intrinsic relationship to the character. In Fallout New Vegas, you've got the mystery of like, what is this chip? Why was I shot in the head? Like, all of this kind of stuff. Like, it's that kind of trying to piece together a mystery. It doesn't always have to be that the villain has personally wronged you. But the more of a link that your party has to that antagonist, the more likely they are to be excited to find out more about them, to want to figure out what's going on, and then even maybe stop them, which is the end goal, right? If you're trying to write a compelling antagonist, you want your players to at least be motivated to either join or stop them, because otherwise they're just there,
Yeah, no, definitely. No, and I think a really good part of, like, I think we've mentioned it before, like the idea of like revenge, but also like the fact that it can be interchangeable. Like, is it, are you trying to take revenge on the villain, or are they trying to take revenge on you? Are you even aware that they're trying to do that? It's kind of like how your character and how they are played like really affects how you deal with a villain in a way. But yeah, like there's also the idea of like what we've got written down here. Is the villain even aware of the party's presence, which you've mentioned before, Wheels, with the whole cosmic horror
Exactly.
approach?
Right. Yeah, like we gave Galactus as the example, but it also works for like your Lovecraft stuff.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Like, is the like threat that the antagonist provides even personal to you? Like, is it more interesting if it's not? Is it like the world is going to end and someone has to do something about it.
Yeah.
Like, you then sort of give your platform for your characters to tell that sort of like, you know, if not us, then who kind of like, you know, scenario where it's just like, well, someone has to do something about this, so we might as well.
Yeah, a good example of that I haven't played like Call of Cthulhu yet, which I would really like to play, but in Eldritch Horror, the board game, you are running around chasing these creatures and these gods all around the planet. That's the whole point of the game. You go into different locations and stuff, and you're having to kind of like divvy your time between it, because these things are going to happen regardless of anything you do. You're just kind of like chasing after it and trying your best as an investigator. And also the fact that all these investigators are they're sometimes really arbitrary like roles that don't have anything to do with investigating. Like you have like the cop and you have like the martial artist and stuff who you might expect to do this kind of thing. But you also have like a musician and like a secretary and stuff like that. And so it's like, why have they stepped up, these perfectly normal people, to take on something that's way bigger than them? And I think that's really interesting as well.
Yeah, you've got like the burden that comes with that as well, which is really interesting for your characters. Like, why did it have to be me? All that kind of stuff. I think it's worth saying as well, like your, just to jump back to our goal point, you know, we talk a lot about like world-ending events and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't have to be that grand, and I think a lot of the time, something that big can be really exhausting. I hate the trend now in all stories where it's like, everything is going to be destroyed if this character doesn't do anything. It's just like, surely not everyone in the world is this important, you know? Sometimes it can be a bit more personal. Like, you know, we talk a lot about like world-ending, life-threatening situations. Maybe if you're playing like a sort of slice-of-life, small-town like kind of character, you know, there could be that classic sort of 80s movie villain where they are like big business coming in to destroy the small town that you've grown up in and have all these memories of. Like, even if you maybe don't necessarily care about the village itself, like maybe you at the small town that you come from or whatever, maybe you have bad memories there, but also maybe like your mum lives there, or like maybe your best friends still like hang out around the block and stuff, and it's all going to get taken away from you. Like, that's a compelling thing that you don't necessarily have to hate the person who's doing it. You don't have to necessarily be against what the company stands for, but just the very fact that they are threatening something that is dear to the players and the characters means that they are then compelled to go against that. And again, by the end of it, you might think, and you know, crap story if so, but you might think, oh, maybe this company aren't so bad after all. I mean, name a situation where that's true, but yeah, like it's up to those players then to deal with that, because it's not just this villain exists and he's threatening us. It's like a compelling situation that they find themselves in, you know? Sometimes there is no physical person who is the antagonist. Sometimes it's just an idea, you know? Like, sometimes, I mean, there have been literal wars waged in the past 100 years or so that have just tried to kill an ideology, you know? Like, that is a thing that, you know, people, like, even though it's kind of fruitless, people want to war against things they don't agree with, right?
Rage Against the Machine, it's like, where do you start?
Yeah, well, I'm talking about, like, you know, Vietnam and stuff like that, where it's just like, you know, it wasn't necessarily a war that was started because, you know, Mr. Evil Man from Vietnam was doing bad things. It was like they didn't want communism to spread as an idea, right? So it's like, whether your characters agree with that or not, they're in a position where it's like, well, we're in this place. What do we do about it, for example?
I think it's interesting as well that you mentioned, like, maybe a relation to you is being affected by this kind of thing. Like, has somebody that you love come to you and said, like, hello, can you help with this? Because I'm scared. And like, how, and if that's the case, how do you convince your party then to then care about this and be like, hey, can we go sort this out? Because like, my mum's really worried.
Yeah.
You know, like, how is that a big enough motivator for people that maybe it's the start of the campaign and you don't know each other? How would that affect things? And also, like, there's also like a kind of call to arms kind of thing. Like, if there's like a bunch of people who really need help and they have come to you for help, like, is that something that you would like to pursue? Like, I think a good example of that might be like the Curse of Strahd, where there's a big bad guy, and and everyone in the entire country city, either way, wherever they are, Barovia, everyone is terrified of them. And it's like, cool, well, we can't leave until this guy is gone. So I guess that makes it a bit of a motivator for us. But also, you know, everyone seems a bit subdued. Maybe we should help out.
You've got an example there of like, there is like a moral thing that your players can latch onto, but also if they don't care about morals, if they're not that good a person, there's also like an inconvenience or you know, anything that is going to drive them to be like, well, crap, now I have to do this.
Yeah.
But you mentioned like multiple people are being affected by something. That's like a really good hook to build your party around as well.
Yeah.
Like if all of your characters are completely disparate people who don't really have any like thing that binds them, but they have all been affected by what the antagonist is trying to do, or like, you know, the worldview that has driven them into this bad position they're in, then they have like a common goal that they're all willing to go against together. So even if they have differences between them, even if they're not necessarily the kind of people that would normally get into a party together, they have that thing that is putting them together. Like I said with the tadpoles, right? In Baldur's Gate 3, you've got like a compelling hook where it's like, we have to work together, otherwise we're all going to die. So I don't care if we're not getting along, you need to pick that sword up and help me, you know? Yeah,
totally. And I think so I'm playing a game right now where there's a really interesting way that kind of our DM, my DM Bob, has like gotten everyone's like issues together in one place. So they keep getting kind of called into like a dream realm. And so all of their fears and anxieties are kind of coming together, and like every time that they're in there, they keep, you know, getting attacked by these things, and they're like way blown out of proportion because they're in this dream realm. And it's like, that's a really interesting way to like tie everyone together. Like, oh, hey, we all basically need therapy. What do we do with this now? And it's just kind of like an example of how there's always a way for you to like tie your party together in a way. Yeah, and give them one common goal as well.
And here's a fun idea for you to chew on as well. Sometimes, you know, your antagonist is not actually trying to achieve anything. They're in the perfect position. But the existence of the player characters is threatening that.
Yeah.
So let's say, for example, you know, maybe you're doing like a sort of sports anime style RPG, right? And like the antagonists are like the super group sports stars who have been on top of the world forever. And they're not necessarily bad people at the start of the story, but the fact that your team keep getting better and better and better and taking the limelight away from them, suddenly you're disturbing the status quo that they want, and they want to return things to normal. So maybe they're willing to play dirty to do that, like all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the initial like, cosmic horror of them not knowing you exist.
The eldritch superstars.
The eldritch volleyball team. But yeah, no, that's really good. I feel like another example of that, I don't know why I keep thinking of She's the Man with Amanda Bynes.
Wow.
Just like, I mean, the enemy in that is misogyny. So, like, the concept of misogyny is the enemy, and it's like, she went undercover to deal with that. I really like She's the Man.
Yeah. Well, no, like, I think this is a common thing in cyberpunk stuff, right? It's like, it's not necessarily, like, there is, with a setting like that, if you are actually doing cyberpunk like cyberpunk is supposed to be done, the villain is not Mr. Moneybucks who runs the company. Like, if you kill him, nothing changes. Like, there's no, it's, you know, it's not a case of cutting the head off the snake and stuff like that. Like, there has to be some kind of change in how your society works. So, like, the real enemy is, you know, the sort of corporate capitalist hellscape that you're in, and like it's the system that you are, you know, it's the machine you are raging against, right? Yeah. So like there are situations in which you don't have to have like a face of that enemy. You know, you can, like, to make it a simpler story, if you're just trying to tell something a little bit more breezy, they can sort of be that representation. So maybe Mr. Moneybucks is the person that you're going after, but like there is that kind of realization of the players being like, well, you know, what's this going to achieve? Like, are we fighting towards the right goal, or that kind of stuff? And that can be interesting things to pick apart.
Yeah, definitely. And also, like, even if they don't think about that beforehand, and then they finally get to that point, and they do take the person that they've kind of tied to this ideology out, what do they do then when they realize, like, oh, this was not the solution to our problems? Like, what do they do with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about the goal, we've talked about the relationships with the characters, we've talked about the motivation that got them in the place where they are. Now, you've got like your idea, like let's say that you've drafted in your head, you're like, oh, it'd be really cool if I did this. Maybe there's like one of the things we raised and that really like electrified your brain. You're like, oh, that's a cool idea. What if we did this? Now it's a case of making them come to life. And the main thing that you want to do with that is make them believable.
Yeah.
And believability is, as we said, like an antagonist is just a character in a story. All characters should be believable.
Yeah.
They should all have something they're striving towards. They should all be constantly changing because that's how people are. Like people change over time. You can't stay stagnant. Sometimes, if they are staying stagnant, that is the thing that they need to change because like they need to get with the times, etc. So, like we said, villain has to be multidimensional. Like it's not just necessarily. Let's say that you've got a villain who, let's go back to our taking over the city thing, right? If that's the only thing that they care about is I want to be the mayor
like no
or king or whatever of this. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Like no one ever was. If they just want to be like the leader of this place and that is all they care about, there's only so far that goes, right?
Yeah.
That's where you get that's where the motivation comes in, right? Where it's like, okay, sure, they want to be the leader, they want to be the big boss, and here's why. But what is it about that makes them human? Like, is it because of their inherent greed, like we talked about? Like, is it one of those characters who's been given everything and he refuses to ever be like refused himself? Or is there something a bit deeper than that? Like, is there like some kind of like personal revenge he's taking on the person who's currently in charge?
Yeah.
Is there like a sort of like damage of his pride that he's taken this person, and now he's like, well, how dare you? Like, I'll show you.
Yeah.
I'll do this in response. Like, is there like some kind of thing that they are trying to change in the world?
Yeah.
Like, maybe. I think about, for example, Mr. Freeze from Batman in the animated series. He's an antagonist, but the central sort of like motivation behind what he's doing, he's trying to advance the technology that makes him who he is because his love is like frozen in time because she has some kind of illness that cannot be currently cured or something like that. I'm kind of butchering it a little bit because I don't remember it fully, but it's that thing of, they're not necessarily only obsessed with becoming the biggest, freeziest boy. They're just like, it's a means to an end to achieve what they want. Think about, like, I don't think it's a great motivation, but think about Thanos, for example, with the whole, like, oh, if I get rid of half of the universe, then it will stop the energy crisis, which is bit misguided, but at the very least, like, he has like a reasoning behind what he's doing. Like, he has like a thing that you can then argue against, for example.
I think that what makes Thanos an extremely scary villain is just how determined he is to do what he's doing, and the fact that nobody can convince him otherwise. Like, that to me is what makes
it's delusion, isn't it? Yeah, it's like, oh, this person isn't just like, say you've got like some kind of fantasy like religion that are being, really aggressive and xenophobic and like zealous with their expansion or whatever. Sometimes it's not just, oh, this person believes in this god and that god is being a bit evil. It's also like, well, they've spent their whole life practicing this and preaching it, so like there is a level of separation that they just can't deal with because it's like, well, this this religion is my life, for example. Like I can't just put it to the side, and it allows that character to maybe start from a position where like they were kind of believable and like sympathetic, where it's like, okay, cool, like you were just trying to do good, like this is how you were raised and whatever, and then you can see the slow decline of where they are. And again, that just gives you more options as a player to be like, well, we don't have to kill this person, like maybe we can convince them to see the wrong in his ways and stuff like that. It's like, look at what you've done. Like, how can you think this is okay? But then you've also got that other element of like, have they already been thinking about that and they've decided that it's just too late? Like, they've already gone down this path and they need to finish it, like all that kind of stuff. Like, there's loads of ways in which you can add like an extra element to your villain to make them either more sympathetic or more believable or like even more abominable. Like, maybe there's something about them that you're just like, I can't believe anyone would ever do that. We have to do something, sometimes even a character who isn't that morally good will see one action from someone and think, even I think that was too far, they need to be stopped.
Yeah, and I think also an interesting idea is like, I'm going to bring up the Briarwoods and Percy again, because it's kind of about what the Briarwoods turn Percy into as well, because Percy becomes a kind of a villain, spoilers, in himself, because he's so hell-bent on taking revenge on these people. And there's a really cool part of it where he has everyone that he needs to take revenge on printed onto his gun, and like once he finally kills them mercilessly, that's when they disappear from the gun. And it's like, there's like a physical manifestation of that as like a shadow demon thing, and it's like, what is this sense of vengeance turning you into, and like, is there redemption for you, and can you just kind of like, can you heal yourself by trying to do your best for them, maybe? And just, yeah, thinking about that is quite interesting.
Yeah, like it's that relationship between the character and the villain that makes them even more interesting, right?
Yeah,
and that adds to the believability and the...
Yes.
Because it's like, you know, if your characters can see a part of themselves in that villain, like if they're like, oh God, is that what I, you know, have been turning into? Is that what I've been working towards? Then not only does it make them more believable just because they like, you know, they empathize a bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like, oh, I see how this happened to you and I need to make sure that doesn't happen to me.
Yeah.
But it also gives them another like reason to be compelled by them, you know?
Like, can I bring them back from that point because I've managed to bring myself back from that point?
Or if I can't bring them back from that point,
Yeah.
what does that say about my future? You
Yeah.
know, like how terrifying it is that to see someone who, you know, let's like to have that sort of like religious example. Let's say you've got this zealot, you know, maybe your character is a part of that religion as well, and they're like, oh God, is that what I'm destined to become? Like if I can't stop this person from going down that track, am I doomed to one day find myself there, you know?
Yeah, and that's maybe why they're so invested in it. That could be a good source of investment as well. But I think it's kind of interesting to tie in. So we made another video. We've made a couple of these videos now, but we did a video on how to make a compelling character as well, and a character you won't get bored of. And I think that's kind of a good way to approach making a villain as well.
Oh, there's definitely, crossover. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like you should be building this villain from the ground up as if they are a character that you're going to play, because you will be playing them, and like taking into account like everything like that we've mentioned here, but also that we mentioned in that video, like their motivation, like where they came from, this, that, and the other, is a good way to approach making a villain and making them believable as well.
Yeah, like if you're the GM, like, you know, you do play a lot of characters as the GM, and you can't really dedicate that much time to all of them, but your central antagonist is, you know, supposed to be one of the most important characters in the entire plot. So, like, give them that level of attention, like, give them that level of, like,
depth.
care, and, like, play a character that you want to play, like make them interesting enough that you're like, oh, I can't wait for them to meet this person because I'm really excited to introduce them to you.
Yeah,
you know?
like even like if there's a really good villain that pops up and like everyone in the party is just like, oh my God, they're here. Like that's one of the best things to achieve, where it's just like, I've made such a commanding presence because I've put so much thought into this, and people are like scared or excited or
So, final point on believability is something that we've talked quite a lot about, is sympathetic. So, the word sympathetic, like, is quite obvious what it means. Like, if there is a villain where you're just like, I can see why you're like this, it doesn't necessarily mean I agree with what you're doing or what the world like has become because of you. Like, but I understand where you're coming from. That, again, like we said, that empathy allows your players to see an aspect of themselves in them and therefore make them more human, more real. The difficult thing about sympathetic villains is that you need to have like an answer, or at least like your players need to come to some kind of answer, and like you need to respect that, because the problem with sympathetic villains is that if they have a point, it can often feel like a cop-out to not explore it. So the example that I talk about quite a lot is, and this is spoilers for The Legend of Korra.
Okay.
But the first season of Legend of Korra, the general plot, and this is literally the ending, so if you've not watched it yet, like, feel free to skip past this. But the literal ending is like, you've got this figure, this masked figure who is like, I believe that the society we are living in is unjust, because those that have the power to bend, which if you're not familiar with Avatar, it's magic, right?
Yeah.
For those that have magic are way more powerful. They're essentially like superhumans. So all of us that don't have that power are essentially second-class citizens. And the problem is, like, they weren't wrong. Like, there were a lot of people who felt that way, and it raised like a revolution. And you could feel the writers get to that point and go, oh no, why is this person the bad guy? Because like someone who's leading like a revolution for social change to make a more just and more fair society, you know, it puts them in a position where it's like, well, like, are they really the villain? Because like the characters have to look at themselves then and think, am I doing the right thing by fighting against this?
Yeah.
And the way that they got out of that is essentially something I really don't agree with, which is, first of all, like, they did the classic thing that a lot of writers do with revolutions, which I think is really played out, which is to make them, like, too violent, right? Where it's just like, oh, you know, yeah, sure, I agree with your point, but you've gone too far, which only really is satisfying up to a point because, like, especially in a society where those people have had violence done unto them, like, there is a point where it's just like, well, you know, violence begets violence. Like, there is a point where those characters feel justified because, like, well, you know, I'm not given the same respect. So, you know, if you've got like a world in which, I mean, a really good example of that is Bioshock Infinite. Again, spoilers for that, but there is like, they have a very ham-fisted look at like social justice and like race relations in like the 20s. But essentially, like, you've got like this revolution of people of color who are like, we don't want to live in this world anymore because they are slaves in this world.
Yeah.
And then the characters are like, oh, but we can't make them the good guys, which you know says a lot, I think, about the people writing that story. But then they were like, oh, they're too violent. You know, they do too much violence, and it's just like, well, I mean, there's been quite a lot of examples of where they've had violence done quite a lot onto them.
Very prominently, yes.
Yeah, and they don't have the power to change it. So yeah, like the second thing they do as well is basically just like show that this character is a bender.
Yeah,
which is just like that doesn't.
I was like, I think I remember. Wait a minute.
Yeah, that doesn't undermine his argument.
No.
So like you like that. Those are the pitfalls of writing a villain like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't. It's just like, be prepared for your characters to maybe not even disagree with them, and like are you prepared for that to be an eventuality? Because if you're going with like, you know, like if you're inventing your own villain in like a sort of like pre-written module and something, and that is not prepared for that, you're going to run into plot holes if like your character's like, well, we kind of agree with him and we want to join the equalists or whatever they were called, you know.
Yeah, like
so, yeah.
I think it's interesting as well, depending on if your character's kind of your party is like morally grey. Yeah, do you want to take the risk of making a really sympathetic character, or do you want to make one that is just like, I'm going to destroy everyone? Like, you know, like, think about how your characters, your party might approach them.
Well, that's why I brought up New Vegas as an example before, because it's like, the interesting thing about New Vegas is there are essentially two major factions, and then like a sort of middle one, and they're kind of all bad, which like, it's becoming a bit of a trend now to just make everything a bad option, which isn't necessarily the greatest, but you've got like a faction that essentially resembles like a fascist state, which is bad. Like, they're based off the Roman Empire, so like they do slavery, like they do terrible things, but they have so much military might behind them that to stop them is almost impossible. But on the converse side of that, you've got a character who basically represents democracy, but it's that very flawed democracy that we all live in right now. You know, like it's bureaucratic and people are suffering, and like, you know, the people under their reign are looking to other people on the other faction's reign who are doing fine and saying, well, you know, well, maybe we'd be better off. And it's that position then is way more interesting for your players to have to wrestle with, because it's like, do you take the probably objectively morally better option, which may inevitably crumble to pieces, or do you take the morally bad option that might actually save some of the people you care about, for example? Like, there's like a complex decision you have to make, you know?
Yeah.
And like, there's no perfect answer. But yeah.
Yeah, as I guess I got an immediate example of that, which was, so spoilers for Life is Strange, Season 1.
This is the spoiler section.
Yeah. So, yeah, the first season of Life is Strange, at the end, you have to make a choice between, like, killing your closest friend / love, or like keeping them alive and risking the entire town. And it's like, both of those options suck.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, it's something that a lot of people are like, why would you do that? I chose to save my best friend / love. Obviously I did. And for me, that was like, this is a pretty good ending. Yeah, I'm happy with that. And then all my friends were like, but so many people in the town died. It's like, well, it's game, and I'll do what I like, so...
Yeah, like, it's like you are a character at that point. And I
Yeah.
think what's really interesting about those kind of stories is because they are like a safe space for you to explore those ideas, because no one's actually going to die.
Yeah.
Like, it gives people, like, learning opportunities and stuff like that. And, again, this is one of the dangers of writing this kind of story is that, like, you need to be quite confident in your own beliefs on the situation because... you can almost find yourself like teaching people things that you don't agree with by accident. I would imagine. Like you probably find yourself like, oh no, wait, I don't want you to think that.
Wait a minute.
But yeah, like that is something that is an option to you, and like it is tricky. So like be careful. But those are some of the best stories of all time. Are the ones where like it's difficult to tell where you're actually supposed to be standing on this.
Yeah, that's true. Life is Strange is the best story of all time.
That is just not correct. Things to avoid. That opinion.
No.
Things to avoid. So, like, this is just like a sort of follow-up of, like, are there things that you probably shouldn't do? Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about villains here, so, like, there's always going to be some dodgy stuff.
Yes.
The obvious thing is players' lines and veils, which is something you wrote in Liv, which, like, if you are writing a character that literally does the kind of thing that one of your players is expressly concerned with not seeing or talking about, that's dumb. Don't do that.
Do not.
That's such a bad idea.
Yep,
Please don't do that.
Yeah.
Like, you're not cool for being edgy. Please don't do that. Just, like, respect your players.
Yeah, I was going to say respect your players. Like, respect. Like, that's the reason that we have lines and veils.
Yeah.
Make sure you talk about that with them as well at the start. That's definitely something, because like you might have planned something and then you realize, oh no, that interferes with like my players' lines and veils.
Yeah.
You have to go back and you have to restructure that to make it
But
safe.
like easier is to just ask them before you start playing anything. Like if you know who your players are, just be like, I want to tell a story that's sort of around this. Are there any things in that you're worried about? Or just tell me all the things that you're worried about in advance, and then I don't have to like worry about stepping into something that I'm not supposed to be talking about.
Yeah, definitely. And like always remember the X card as well. That's a very helpful tool. If you accidentally do put something in there that a player is not comfortable with, then they can just pop their X card in and then you move on.
Yeah, we have a video on the channel called like Top Tips for GMs. One of them is about sort of safety tools, and like the important thing to remember as well is that like they are not static. Like people will change over time, like we said, like it's part of being human.
Yeah.
Things will become traumatic that they hadn't even touched on beforehand. So like if they come to you and say, hey, I'm really sorry, but my lines and veils have changed because like I am now in a position where I don't want to talk about that anymore, I don't want to think about that, then you have to respect that because like, sorry, even if it obstructs the story you're trying to tell, like it's better to be in a position where your players are having a good time.
Yeah, definitely.
My laptop's turned off, so you can do the next point.
I will absolutely. I was going to say as well on that people might not even know what is a trigger for them until it appears. So like that's definitely something to think about. Keep in mind. The next point, Wheels, I'm in charge now, is making them too much like a real life figure, which you popped in, I think.
Yeah, I think this kind of like a secondary point to what we just made, but when you like if you base your villain off of like a notoriously bad person from real life, there are like that sets a dangerous position for yourself, especially if you try and make them like sympathetic.
Yeah,
like,
no.
For example, if you were telling, I don't know, a World War II story, that's not a position where people might want to have a sympathetic villain to go up against.
No.
Especially if it's the main guy. I don't think they want to feel bad about him because the things that he did are so morally irreprehensible that like there's there's nothing that you would want to ever give to that kind of person, I personally think. But
for example, in a RPG that we recently played through, Paradox Perfect, which you should definitely go check out. We'll put a link here. There is a character that is involved in like World War II and tries to change the past so that like the British don't win. Well, the British and the rest of the world don't win. But our response was to immediately
no talk, nothing. Just immediately explode him into viscera. So like there's. Yeah, at some point, it's fine to tell stories about like that. If you're in a group that are interested in it, like we're giving World War II as an example because it's one of the, unfortunately, it's one of the greatest atrocities of human history.
Yep.
So like if that is something that you want to tell a story about and you are doing that responsibly and with like an adult mindset, then I don't think that's like wrong. It's more just the fact that like be careful if you are basing your story off of real world events because. Those are real world events. Like at this point, it's not just a story. Like you need to treat not just your players, but like the actual past with respect.
Yeah, definitely. Like even if it's on like a smaller scale, like if somebody were to put like, I'm really into true crime. If somebody were to put like a serial killer in there, I'd be like, no, I'm not involved with that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's like a horrible event in living memory. Like there are other things that you could probably be exploring instead. You can also you don't have to have a real person. Like it can be like inspired by. If, for example, like if you're looking for someone who like really is a bad person, and you want to be inspired by real world events, that's fine. But like doing a one-to-one, this is that person who I'm role playing right now. Yeah. It can come off a little bit uncomfortable for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you need to be very, very careful about that. I'm not saying that. I'm going to send you to jail if you do it, but it's in your best interest to really, really think hard about why you're trying to do that.
Because your players might just immediately kick them in and explode them, and that's fair.
Shout out to Kick and Keith.
The next point that we have is cartoonishly evil figures in serious worlds. So the kind of. I mean, it could be the opposite of making a serious villain in cartoonish worlds, which we can just roll into the same point.
Yeah, but the point is it's your villain should reflect the world that they're in.
Yeah.
So if you have Dr. Evil with his mega laser in your very serious drama.
Game of Thrones.
Yeah, it's going to be a little bit weird. One of the points I put on there is if you do the reverse, it can be interesting. Maybe you're in a fun cartoon hijinks world, but then something actually horrible happens, and as long as your players are okay with that, that can be a really interesting rug pull situation where the players are what? Which is really cool and fun, but it's something that you need to be aware of. If you just have a antagonist that just doesn't fit the tone of the story you're telling, they're going to stick out like a sore thumb.
Yeah,
so
totally.
Be careful of that, basically.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's pretty much it. Don't make Doctor Doom, Doctor Evil Doom,
unless you want to.
Yeah. when on charge, you do what you like. But this is our humble suggestion.
Yeah.
But I think that's about it. Wheels.
Yeah. Thanks very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, we've done a couple of these now. We have one on how to make a compelling character in general. So if you're making a character to play as rather than as an antagonist, and you want to make sure that it's one that you stick around with for ages, that it's how not to get bored of your RPG character. And the other one that we did, Liv,
was how D&D combat kind of sucks. It took me a while to remember what it was. I was like, yes. But it's basically us discussing how, as people with different opinions on D&D combat, I quite enjoy it, and Wheels doesn't like it very much, and you also have examples of ways that other RPGs have done it better.
And looking at RPG combat as a whole as well, just why is it how it is? How can we make it more interesting and more accessible, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's kind of a very even look at we try to be as even as possible, especially because we both have quite differing opinions on a lot of stuff, so
life is strange. Thanks very much for watching this video. We have been Dicebreaker, I've been Wheels, and this has been Liv. If you've enjoyed watching us and want to see more of our content, then please do hit subscribe, click the bell icon to get notified whenever we put a new video live, and why not give us a like as well? That'd be lovely. Thank you very much. Leave a comment below with your top tips for everyone out there. Keep it kind, keep it nice, and spread the good word of RPGs and let us know what you do in situations like this. And if you want to see more from Dicebreaker in general, why not head over to dicebreaker.com, our home and hearth, where we have fantastic amounts of content when it comes to reviews and previews and interviews and all kinds of views that you can think of, as well as stuff from our contributors, like the best RPGs to play in X situation, for example, that you might be finding yourself in. Top of that, just thanks very much for watching and have a lovely day. Bye.
Bye.